Welcome everyone to our Latin American History Seminar, week 5 here in Oxford. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all and to welcome our guest speakers this afternoon. Before I introduce our guest speakers, I just want to say a brief word about our Latin American History Seminar for those of you who are being with us for the first time. The seminar was launched in October 2013, so we'll soon be celebrating our 10th anniversary, I hope. Since then, we've been meeting pretty regularly every Thursday throughout the academic year during the 3 terms. And I think since the pandemic, we moved this into Zoom, and has given us great opportunity to meet colleagues and friends across the Atlantic outside Oxford, and encouraging a dialogue in many aspects of the history discipline. And so therefore, it's very open. We don't specialize in a particular topic or area or period. And it's a great opportunity to keep in touch with the work of colleagues and what's going on in the discipline. And since we launched this in Zoom, we introduced this new series called the Tertulia, which is an opportunity to discuss recent books written by colleagues. And precisely what gathered us today is to discussion of Roberto Breña's recent books. And so it gives me a great pleasure to introduce all friends and colleagues like Roberto and Juan Simal, who are with us today. Roberto Breña is professor and researcher at the Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City, where he is at the moment. And he is the author of a book that I'm sure many of you know, El primer liberalismo español y los procesos de emancipación en América, 1808-1824, published in 2006, and many other books, including the 2 books that will be discussed today, Las Revoluciones Hispánicas y la Historiografía Contemporánea, and Liberalismo, Independencia en la Era de las Revoluciones, both published last year, the first with Marcial Pons and the second by Peter Lang. And he is author of several articles and chapters in books on topics pretty much also related to the topic of today and the Hispanic revolutions and the topic of liberalism. And to discuss his book, we also have the luck to count on Juan Simal, who is Associate Professor of History at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. He's the author of the books Emigrados, España y el Exilio Internacional, and La Era de las Grandes Revoluciones en Europa y América, 1763-1848, pretty much therefore a topic at his heart in the discussion with the topic today. And he is the author of a couple of chapters in books around the topic, one co-edited by Mauricio Isabella, Mediterranean Diasporas, and the other in a book co-edited by Joanna Innes and Mark Philp, Reimagining Democracy in the Mediterranean, whose project actually when I met first Juan Luis. So it gives me great pleasure to have both Juan Luis and Roberto in our seminar. So Juan Luis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this seminar. Thank you, Eduardo. It's a great pleasure to be here and have this conversation around the recent work of Roberto Breña. We are having this conversation on the occasion of the publication of 2 books by Roberto, which I have only read one of them, which is Liberalismo e Independencia en la Era de las Revoluciones, México y el Mundo Hispánico, which was published last year by El Colegio de México. And then there's another second book, which I will make a reference briefly because I have not read, although I understand that some of the chapters included in that book were published also some years ago, and some of them I have read. Because both books are a compilation of essays written by Roberto in the last 20 years or so, which were published in different journals and books. And he has now compiled them and put them together into these 2 different books. He, at least with Liberalismo e Independencia, he has revised all of these texts, and some of them with relevant changes, with additions, with improvements. So they are now offered in such a an updated fashion. So if any of you have read one of these texts, say 10 years ago, you might want to reread it now, because it is likely that you will find something new in it. So the other book by Roberto, that is all published almost simultaneously with this other one, has a very long title: Las Revoluciones Hispánicas y la Historiografía Contemporánea, Historia de las Ideas, Liberalismo e Ilustración en el Mundo Hispánico durante la era de las Revoluciones. It's published with Peter Lang. And it's obvious that these two books are a testimony to the immense productivity of Roberto's research. I am sure that today's seminar, this Oxford tertulia, will be fun and enjoyable, because Roberto Breña is a great conversationist. He's very eager to enter debates and discussions and even polemics. He does not run away from discussing important and controversial questions. In fact, in the introduction of the book, he affirms that the book has an explicit critical tone, that he wants to engage in debates about his interpretations, his proposals, because he thinks, and I quote him here, that the best way to make historiography advance is by adopting such a critical tone. Therefore, I truly invite the public here today to start thinking about potential comments and questions for the Q&A section later on. Roberto, I might say, is particularly concerned in some of the essays in this book about the transfer of historiographical approaches and visions and turns and fashions that are mostly developed in the Anglo-American Academy, right? And he is concerned about the use of these perspectives to the interpretation of the history of the Hispanic world, and specifically the history of the Spanish-American revolutions. This is something that the readers of the book, of these two books, will find in a clear way, and I'm sure Roberto will engage in explaining us exactly why. However, by any means, this means that Roberto rejects that historiography altogether. On the contrary, he's very, very well informed about the publications in the USA, in Britain, in France, in Spain, in Portugal, in Brazil. If you read his texts, you will find references to dozens of non-Hispanic authors. As an example, and this is, I am sure, something that will come up, he's been quite critical about the use of some paradigms of Atlantic history. He has raised concerns about the dangers, what he considers dangers of the application of Atlantic paradigms and analytical tools to Latin America, as they were defined mostly in the USA. However, this doesn't mean that he rejects what he considers the most valuable elements that the Atlantic approach has to offer, although he probably finds fewer valuable elements than, for instance, I do. But to see how he engages with Atlantic history and Atlantic approaches, I would suggest that you watch the interview that Roberto conducted with Werner Balin, which is available on YouTube, and I think is quite interesting because the conversation they have about these topics and some other. Roberto is also a very honest academic. So he's worried about what he considers the excesses of Atlantic history and of global history, but he is also worried about what he calls Mexicocentrism. That is the need to look beyond national history, in this case, mostly Mexican history. I have a number of questions. I would like to start by quite a direct question for Roberto, which is, do you consider yourself a historian? And I say this because the reader of the book might be surprised to find in the prologue, in the introduction to the book, that Roberto defines himself as a historiographer, rather than as a historian. And he says, I quote, "I am not a historian by training nor calling." says, "No soy historiador por formación ni por vocación." If I am correct, you did not study history, you studied political science. You work at the Center for International Studies at the Colegio de México. But the truth is that you're mostly engaged with the study of the past, with historiographical debates, you engage mostly with professional historians. So yeah, how do you define yourself academically?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Juan Luis. And before I answer or try to answer your questions, I want to thank Eduardo for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, also thank Juan Luis for accepting being my co-converse, I don't know how to say it, whatever, no, to participate with me in this event today. No, just one minor clarification because of what Eduardo said at the beginning. The first book is this one. Both were published in 2021. The first one is this one. It was published by Peter Lang last year in Europe. And the second one is this one that was published also last year by El Colegio de México, with a difference of about 3 months. No, this one came out around the middle of the year, and this one came out in September. As you can see, the extension the difference is considerable. The first one has only nine texts, and the second one has 18. And the topics are also different because the first one was conceived mainly for a Spanish and a European audience. And the second one was conceived mainly for Latin American audience, and more specifically even at least half of the text for a Mexican audience. That is something that I thought it was important to start with that, because this is originally it was going to be only one book, but for different reasons it came out. It turned out that there were too many texts that I thought that they were worthy to include it from my perspective, of course. And in the end, it became this project of a single book became 2 books. Now coming back to Juan Luis' questions. Well, I cannot consider myself a historian because I'm not trained as a historian. No, I studied political science, I studied political theory, I studied the history of political thought, but I never studied history as such. So I think that it was important for me to state that in the introduction. I think in both introductions, I said something in that sense. So how do I define myself? I do not define myself as a historian. I define myself as a historiographer. I don't know if that category exists as such. It's not very much used as far as I can see. But in any case, that is what I do more than anything else. No, I read a lot of how historians wrote history, the debates about history, but I'm not a historian in the conventional or traditional sense of the word. And I thought that was important for the audience to know, in order for them not to expect something that I cannot deliver. No, my interest, my main interest is historiography. Of course, in a certain sense, you cannot be a historiographer without, in a certain sense, being a historian. But I am sure that the audience understands more what I'm trying to say. So if Juan Luis, if you want me to define myself, I would define myself, as I do in both introductions, as a historiographer.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say that you're clearly also a historian of political ideas, concepts, languages, historian of politics, right? You're mostly concerned with the role of political ideas in history. You're very concerned also, that's my feeling, about placing political ideas in their historical contexts, right? You study how they develop, how they are put into practice. You are not so much concerned about political theory, not about theoretical issues or merely intellectual debates. You trace how ideas are generated. You are interested in how they move around, how they circulate, how they are appropriated, how they are adapted to local and also changing circumstances. I would say that you're quite concerned with the challenges of and problems of anachronism, with the need to be constantly aware of the historical circumstances, to be cautious, not to attribute ahistorical faculties to ideas and to concepts. Therefore, in many ways, I see that you are close to the proposals of the schools of the history of concepts, Koselleck and Begriffsgeschichte, to the work that, for instance, Javier Fernández Sebastián has led on Iberconceptos project, also to the history of political languages and ideas in context. But at the same time, I don't quite see you fitting totally within these schools. You do not seem to me to use the same methodology. Am I right? Can you comment on this?
Yeah. Well, the first thing about my interest in political ideas, concepts, languages, I think that has to do with, I studied an MA in philosophy here in Mexico, and then I went to Canada, and at McGill University, I studied political theory with Charles Taylor. And I think that has to do a lot with the way I approach history. That's the only way I know how to approach history. With let's say, a theoretical context, but at the same time, and you already mentioned that, and you said it maybe more clear than I can state it, and it's the fact that I'm not interested in ideas in themselves. I'm interested in ideas in their historical context, in the way they are applied, in the way they are practiced. No, I'm very skeptical, and in several of the articles of both books, you can notice that. I'm very skeptical about the role that very often historians and historiographers give to ideas. No, and this purported very strong influence or direct influence. My experience, at least with the history of the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, tells me something else. No, and I think that's a constant since I started writing about these topics 20 something years ago. So you're right. It's a I don't know if it's a strange combination. In part, it's being very conscious about the role and the importance of theoretical issues, but at the same time being skeptical about the role of ideas in historical development. You mentioned anachronism. Yeah, that's one. If you put ideas in their context, if you really try to do that, or if you do that, the issue of anachronism has to come out. No, it'll come out immediately, I would say. No, if you stay with ideas just floating, I don't know where, then maybe anachronism may not be an issue. But the moment you start trying to put ideas in context, in historical context, and how are they applied and how are they practiced, immediately the issue of anachronism will come out, I think. And about your last point, Koselleck and the Cambridge School. No, I would not fit in any of those two schools. But on the other hand, and this is something that it's a truism, but I think it's important that I mention this at this point because of your question, Juan Luis. And it's the fact that you use a methodology when you think that methodology fits, let's say, or is useful for what you are trying to transmit, for what you are trying to say, for what you are trying to convey. And you take from here and you take from there. I mean, I don't believe very much in this. I belong to this school or I belong to that school. No, maybe that was the case, especially I think about Marxism. several days, I mean, since at least, I don't know, 50 years, this thing about belonging to a certain specific school makes not much sense to me, in my view. But I should say something about Koselleck and Geschichte and the Cambridge School, and is the fact that I do not agree with this tendency that is very much present in Latin America of combining these two schools or these two methodologies as if it's simple to do that. It's not simple to do that. And it's not simple to do that because they're very different in many aspects, in many profound aspects, I would say. I'm not going to delve into this, but an article I published last year in the Contributions to the History of Concepts, I state all the arguments that I think can be put on the table to be very cautious, much more cautious than I think many Latin American historians have been, and also Spanish historians have been, regarding the combination of Skinner and Koselleck. This combination is not easy at all, and it's not easy at all, I insist, because there are many reasons behind the specificities of each one of these methodologies. And the fact that so many Latin American historians think they are very easily combined worries me. It has been worrying me for a very long time, in fact. No, this article that appeared just last year in Contributions to the History of Concepts, I've been dealing with this issue for at least 8 years. No, it finally appeared, and that's there in that article are all my arguments regarding why is it that we should be very careful with this combination. First, we have to get to know each methodology individually, and then, of course, there are certain elements that can be combined up to a certain point. But in general, I'm more than skeptical about this combination in a general sense. So that's important that I specify because in the first place, I don't think I fit in any one of them individually. But what worries me regarding these two schools or methodologies is the fact that in Latin America, I don't know, for at least, let's say 10 years, many historians think that they are easily combined. And I don't agree with that way of looking at this issue. And it's an important issue. No, I mean, we're talking here about the two most important approaches of intellectual history of the last 30, 40 years. So it's an important issue, I think.
In terms of methodology, I would say that a trained historian, which I suppose many of us are, would raise some criticism of your work by pointing to the fact that you do not work mostly with archives, with primary sources, with correspondence. You mostly work with pamphlets and essays and written, elaborated discourses, but not so much with the daily practice of going into the archive, for instance. What do you think about this? Is this a conscious decision? Has to do with your training?
Yeah, of course it has to do with my training. And I've been hearing this criticism since I started writing about first Spanish liberalism 20 years ago. And there were many historians, trained historians, and very good historians that were very skeptical about my work for that single reason. The thing is that if you go to my book, the 2006 book on first Spanish liberalism, you will notice that there are a lot of primary sources. No, the fact, let's distinguish here about not being someone who goes often to the archive and not using primary sources. That's I don't know, in the head of, I mean, that's a mistake. That's not the case. You can use a lot of primary sources, but at this point in time, 2022, the amount of original, let's say primary sources, not original if you want, primary sources that are available is enormous. So this is sort of in my view, I will hear what the audience has to say, but this is sort of a false dilemma, to be honest with you. No, if he doesn't go to the archive, he's not a good historian. Okay, to begin with, I'm not a historian, I'm a historiographer, but in any case, I don't think that holds. No, it's just a matter of looking at some of the best history books that have been written in the 20th century. No, a lot of them, the amount of primary sources is minimal. That's not my case. You just have to go to the bibliographies of these two books, no? And you'll see the amount of primary sources there. And that's something different from, well, if Breña doesn't go to the archive, he's not a good historian. Well, I mean, I've heard that, I mean, not like this, but almost like this for 20 years now. And so I'm used to that. What can I tell you? I mean, the audience has to read some of the text and they will decide. If I'm not interested in being a good historian. I'm interested in being a good historiographer, yes, and I don't think that I have to go to the archive often to be a good historiographer, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm. I would say it's fair to say that your main interest is liberalism. That's the focus of your work. You're also, of course, aware of the problems of what I think you defined at some point in the book as seeing liberalism everywhere, or trying to find it everywhere, and the consequences of finding it, of not finding what you expected in terms of a definition of liberalism that is canonical and normative. But the main topic is liberalism, right? Aren't you worried to miss other political traditions and cultures? And I'm of course here referring to republicanism, which will link with my previous question about, for instance, the Cambridge School, right? Because what about republicanism, and not only in Spanish America, but also in Spain, right? Because you're also interested in the history of let's say, peninsular Spain. Your work is transatlantic, truly. You first examine the Cortes of Cádiz and how they develop, and you are very concerned about the ways in which the Spanish intellectual traditions have evolved and have crossed the Atlantic, and etc., etc. So you are also a historian of Spain, not only of Latin America or of Spanish or Hispanic America. But you then consider republicanism only in the American continent and mostly in its institutional incarnations. I would say rather than in the context of the political cultures and practices across the Atlantic, that is also in the Iberian Peninsula. And well, I have, for instance, argued in favor of considering that there were Republican elements in the political culture of Spanish liberalism. And I, of course, I'm not the only one who has proposed this, for looking for Republican elements that are connected to, 18th century traditions in the work of, many authors, some of them very prominent liberals, like, for instance, Quintana. So many authors have written about this. But you are certainly critical of what you might say the need to search or the need to find in Spanish America the tradition of civic humanism and of classical republicanism, as it was described mostly for French and especially the US American cases. And at some point, I think you, of course, you are not alone in this. And you quote at some point Rojas, an article of Rojas, La frustración del primer republicanismo mexicano. And I quote what you say. You say, I think Rojas is right when he highlights that the recovery of any Republican tradition in Latin America has to be done through very different paths from those that Pocock established for the Anglo-American case. Can you share with us which paths you are referring to?
Okay. Well, the first thing, yes, the topic I work the most, I would say, is liberalism. And I think that, if you have to choose an ideology that determines, I don't know if determines is the word, most than any other the age of revolutions, I mean, I would think liberalism would come in the first place. That is not to justify my decision. That's each one of us decides what topic or topics he chooses or she chooses. But since the very beginning, I was very much interested in liberalism. And the reason why I was interested in liberalism is because when I discovered first Spanish liberalism, when I was studying my BA at the Colegio de México many years ago, I realized that there was a tradition, a liberal tradition, but in Spanish. No? And the more I read about that, I said, Jesus, how come in Latin America, nobody knows that the history of liberalism and the history of the liberal tradition has to do not only with Washington and Paris and London, but it also has to do with Spanish America, with Spain and with Spanish America. No? Well, there's a fact that almost everybody here knows about the origin of the word. The origin of the word liberal with specific political connotation started in the Cortes de Cádiz, end of 1810, beginning of 1811. No, this was not accepted 30, 40 years ago. But as I mentioned in one of the, or two of the articles, Hobson was one of the first ones of the Anglophone historians who said that without any further discussion, the origin of the word, the term, the concept liberal with a specific political connotation starting the Cortes de Cádiz, 1810, 1811. This, he said 40 years ago, but he was an exception at that time. But the more you read at this point in time, I'm thinking about Michael Fritten, for example. They now accept that the term liberal started in Spain and therefore in the Spanish-speaking world. No, so it was a surprise to me to find out that. So when I decided to be an academic, and of course to be an academic you have to have a PhD, I knew exactly what I wanted to study. I wanted to study first Spanish liberalism. No, and that's the reason why after Canada I went to Spain to study first Spanish liberalism. No, the thing with first Spanish liberalism in Latin America, at least at present, is that I think there has been a sort of an overreaction on the part of some of the historians that have studied first Spanish liberalism, and I'm including myself in that group. But lately, for the last, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years, there has been an overreaction on the other side. No, and in Mexico, at least, is very clear. And not only in Mexico, I felt that in several Latin American countries. Each time I go to present something or participate in a congress or a seminar or whatever, and that is the fact that what I would say nationalist historians in each country say that why is it that we give that much importance to first Spanish liberalism to explain the Spanish American independence movement? And I think the answer is pretty simple. To begin with, because for about 170 years, 180 years, the only thing that we studied was what was happening here. And the evident question that stems from that fact is, how come are you going to understand what was happening in Spanish America if you don't know what was happening in the metropolis? No, it's like trying to understand the American Revolution. I mean, the revolution of the 13 colonies without knowing what was going on in England. I mean, it's ridiculous. Ridiculous. And that's what nationalist historians have been doing in Latin America for did for 170 years, 180 years, and some of them still want to continue to do that. No, there's no way you can ignore what was going on in the metropolis. If you really want to understand from the perspective of intellectual history and political history, what went on during the Spanish American independence movement, there's no way you are going to understand that if you don't know nothing, or you don't know a lot, I would say, about what was going on in Spain. I mean, as you all know, the beginning of everything was the invasion of Napoleon of Spain in 1807, 1808. In 1807, it was not an invasion, but there was the Fontainebleau agreement. No. But in any case, it turned out in the end it became an invasion. No, so, and everything started there. The Spanish-American independence movements, it started there. I mean, and if in cases like Mexico, or let's talk about New Spain. Oh, I was talking about anachronism a while ago. Let's talk about New Spain. The beginning of the process of independence or emancipation, I would say at the beginning of New Spain, coincided with liberalism in the peninsula. The end of the independence process of New Spain coincided with what? With liberalism in the peninsula. In fact, to a large extent, what Mexicans call la consumación of the Independencia de Mexico. No, I think the word in English, the word is consummation, but I may be wrong. No, let's say the last part is unintelligible if you don't know what was going on in Spain and the return of liberalism in 1820. No, so there are hundreds or I don't know, millions of instances of examples that I can give. Why is it that you cannot understand what went on in Spanish America between 1808 and 1824 if you don't know what was going on in the peninsula? Especially, of course, between 1810 and 1814 and 1820 and 1823, when liberalism was triumphant, let's say. A triumph that, of course, as you all know, or maybe you'll not everybody here knows, but one of the problems, let's say, quotes, with first Spanish liberalism, it was very brief. No, let's say, in the best of cases, it's 1808, 1814, that is 6 years, and then 1820, 1823, that is 3 years. So at most, we're not talking here about even a decade. No, and that's of course poses a lot of problems. No, in the sense that, why is it that Breña and others give so much importance to first Spanish liberalism if it was defeated in the end by Fernando VII and absolutism? Well, I mean, of course, that's the evident advantage. One of the evident advantages of historiography in this case is retrospective. But if we study things in their own context, in their own terms, well, there's a very strong correlation there that explains a lot of things of what went on in Spanish America. So the problem, of course, is that, and I have to agree with that, and maybe I participated in that sense up to a certain point, too much importance was given to the influence of, let's say, the Constitución de Cádiz. No? And even at present, very famous historians, very well, I'm not gonna give a single name throughout the whole conversation, but very famous historians now at this point in time are talking almost about the superiority of the Cádiz Constitution and of the first Spanish liberalism over the insurgent movements and the insurgent documents, constitutional documents and other documents, and that's in my view is preposterous. So once again, it's a matter of equilibrium here. No, let's recognize, of course, the importance of first Spanish liberalism, but let's not overstretch this importance and especially this influence, because as the majority of the audience here knows very well, from a certain point onwards, Spanish Americans forgot about first Spanish liberalism up to a certain point, because it's true that Cádiz, or at least certain aspects of the Cádiz Constitution, were present not only during the Spanish American independence movements, but went much further than that. I would say at least to the middle of the 19th century. But in any case, no, it's once again like what I just said a while ago about Koselleck and Skinner. No, it's a matter of caution. Maybe, yeah, caution and equilibrium. Once again, this is a matter of caution and equilibrium. No, not taking things too far. What is it that we've been witnessing in Latin American historiography for the last at least 15 years? Now, since let's say 2010. Now, Latin American historians now want to find liberalism, republicanism, civic virtue, citizenship. They want to find that all over the place since the very start of the Spanish-American independence movement. I mean, that's, once again, it's a historiographical overreaction. So when you mentioned, Juan Luis, that you said something about giving liberalism a very important place, but at the same time, not trying to find liberalism everywhere. Once again, and this has to do with something I said at the beginning, this has to do with the fact that if you go into what was going on at that very moment in historical terms, in social terms, well, then you have to be very cautious when you posit this ubiquitous, I don't know, yeah, in English, this liberalism that it's all over the place, or this republicanism that is all over the place, or this civic virtue that is all over the place, or this citizenship that is all over the place. I mean, not even now in 2022, that's the case in Latin America. And historians now want to make us believe that liberalism and republicanism and citizenship and even democracy was all over the place in the first quarter of the 19th century. Let's be serious about this.
All right, I just want to make a final last question and then open the conversation to the rest of the public, because there is one issue that I cannot miss commenting, and that is your let's say your attention to, or the way you claim that the Spanish language needs to be incorporated into, let's call it, international academia. You argue that most Anglophone historians overlook and even in some occasions ignore the production of historians working and publishing and writing in Spanish. I could say you would agree also adding to this Portuguese. So since we are in this conversation and talking in English to an audience that is international, that is Anglophone in many ways, can you, and this is a very polemic issue, I am sure, I just want to finish with this and then open the floor to the rest of you.
Well, yeah. Well, the first thing, why are we talking in English? We're talking in English because if we want to get through to more people, and Eduardo knows this very well, well, the English was the language to be used in this seminar. No, if this seminar would have been in Spanish, the audience would have, I don't know how much less audience we would have had, but we would have had less. No, so if I want to get my message through, no, I have at least sometimes to speak in English and to write in English. No, in fact, I think maybe the majority of the last articles I've written are in English. No, and what is behind that? I insist. It's a matter of I want to know the Anglophone historians to hear my arguments, because, and I'm going to start by something that may sound a bit strong, but I can argue this, and if someone wants to discuss this, we can discuss it, of course. The best books that have been written on the Spanish-American independence movements in the last years, they're not in English. They're in Spanish. So if that's the case, no, and I invite the people to go to this article that I wrote for the site, The Age of Revolutions. I give a bibliography of 50 titles. And I have to mention this. Why is it that I wrote that text and sent that bibliography? Because when I went into the site, I found that there were 70, I don't want to miss the number. Yeah, I'm almost sure it was 70. There were 70 titles in English and 2 titles in Spanish on the Spanish. They do not call it the Spanish-American revolutions. They call them the Latin American revolution. Well, on the bibliography of that site, see, that's the Age of Revolutions bibliographic site. The score was 72, 7 English, 2 Spanish. I said, Jesus Christ. No, I've been reading about these topics for 25 years now. And I insist, and I can argue this again. The best books, I think the best books on the topics, on these topics specifically, some of the topics of the Spanish-American independence movements have been written in Spanish. And the other thing, it's not only that some of the best books have been written in Spanish, it's the fact that when you go to the Anglophone authors, you go to the bibliography at the end of their books, what is it that you find? 90% of the books in English, 90%, more or less, of course. I mean, and there are a few exceptions, but very few exceptions. No, there are exceptions, of course there are. No, I was not gonna give any names during the conversation. I'm not gonna do that. But of course there are exceptions. But in general, go to the books written by Anglophone historians, especially I think American historians, about these issues. And why? That's why you suddenly read in some very recent books on some of those American historians things that were said in Spanish, and I'm not exaggerating here, that were said in Spanish 20, 25, 30 years ago. And they think they're sort of discovering, like my friend Chema Portillo likes to say, they think they're discovering Mediterraneans. They're not discovering a thing. The thing is that they don't read in Spanish. Why is it that they don't read in Spanish? Well, the answer is easy. It's very easy. No, the answer is if it's written in Spanish, it's not that good. Well, they're dead wrong. They're absolutely wrong. And that's something that has to change. And before I forget, I have to add something. The reception from the Age of Revolution site was exceptional. When I sent them an email telling them, how come there are 70 titles in English and 2 in Spanish? And you know what the director, I cannot remember his name, but the director replied to me that same day and said, you know what, Roberto, I think you're right. Why don't you write an article about this issue? Because I think you're right, and it's important. So, and I have to say that, because the reception, or let's say the answer or the reaction of the review of the Age of Revolution site was responsible for the fact that at this point in time, you can find that article there. No? And I put 50 titles. I could have put 200, to be honest with you, because I started in 1980, more or less. No? So easily I could have put 200. It was not a matter of putting 200, but you can find there 50 very, very good titles about the study of the Spanish-American independence movement, that they don't ask a thing to the books written in English or the articles written in English. And that's I'm glad that you asked me about this issue, because it's an important point. No? And of course, and I finish with this, it's also a sort of a dilemma. And I'm getting back to what I started with. No, why is it, if Spanish is so important, Roberto, Breña, why is it that you're talking in English? And why is it that you write in English? Well, because if you don't talk once in a while in English, and if you don't write once in a while in English, you don't get through. No, and they're in their small little world discovering Mediterraneans because they don't read us. That would be my answer.
Okay, I think at this point we can open the floor, and Eduardo can, of course, be the chair of this conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Juan Luis and Roberto, for an engaging discussion, and we have plenty of time for Q&A.